very much indeed, John. Can I begin today by associating myself with your opening remarks about the horrific shootings in California, Houston and New York over the weekend. The shootings in particular in Buffalo, New York, as you rightly say, remind all of us of the need to stand united and in solidarity against those who perpetrate hate and division in our societies. But my thoughts are very much today with the bereaved and injured. Thank you for your wider, very kind introduction, and a very grateful thank you from me to Brookings Institution for hosting me at this event today, and for all of you for joining us for this discussion. Due to COVID, this is actually my first time in the United States in 3 years. If you'd told me that back on my last visit in 2019, I would have struggled to believe it would be 3 years before I returned here to the United States. So it's wonderful to be back here in Washington, DC. And I'm particularly pleased to be speaking here at Brookings today. It's no exaggeration to say that your expertise on international affairs is more crucial now than perhaps it has been at any time over the past century. When President Biden spoke at the United Nations last September, he said then that the world was facing an inflection point. And of course, back then he was referring to 3 issues in particular. We were and are still coping with the impacts of the worst pandemic the world has experienced in more than a century. We face and we must address an urgent and accelerating climate emergency, and we are seeing the rules-based international order come under severe and increasing strain. However, since the President made that speech, those strains have become even more severe with Russia's brutal, illegal and entirely unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. I want to be very clear today to you here in the United States that Scotland stands with the United Kingdom, the European Union and countries around the world, including of course the United States, in our condemnation of Putin's actions. We support the severity of economic sanctions on Russia and also the supply of military assistance to Ukraine. We are also in Scotland seeking to play our full part in offering humanitarian aid and supporting as many as possible of those displaced from Ukraine to find refuge, sanctuary and support in Scotland. There is no doubt whatsoever that the first and the most urgent duty of every country across the democratic world right now is to offer tangible support and solidarity to Ukraine as it fights for its democracy, independence and territorial integrity. However, that said, a war of this scale in Europe, not seen before in the 21st century, has also forced European nations to ask really fundamental questions of ourselves. As a result, many of us are now reassessing long-established defence and security positions and priorities. The pleas of Eastern European nations for a much greater focus on the continent's border with Russia have been heard more clearly than ever and are now being rightly responded to. Germany has reversed its long-standing position of not supplying arms to conflict zones, and it has set out plans to significantly increase its own defence spending. And very significantly and very topically here today, 2 of Scotland's northern neighbours, Sweden and Finland, which for decades have remained outside NATO, now seem firmly on track to join the alliance, and with a level of public support in their own countries that would have been unthinkable just a few months ago. That is highly relevant to Scotland. The party I lead, the Scottish National Party, determined back in 2012, at that time, a reversal of a long-standing position, but we decided back in 2012 that should Scotland become independent, it should seek membership of NATO. There's no doubt that the events of the last 3 months have strengthened my conviction that this position is absolutely the right and essential one. And even more firm in my view today, that coupled with a strong relationship with the United Kingdom, membership of the European Union and membership of NATO will be cornerstones of an independent Scotland's security policy. The Scottish Government is acutely aware of Scotland's strategic position on the northern edge of Europe, close to the Arctic. Russian military aircraft regularly approach the UK's area of interest, and in recent years there has been an increase in Russian submarine patrols within the North Atlantic. And so we are clearer than ever that membership of NATO would not only be vital to Scotland's security, although it would most certainly be that, it would also be the principal way in which an independent Scotland in an interdependent world would contribute to the collective security of our neighbours and allies. Current debates about security in Europe, however, are not just about military capabilities and strategic alliances. The invasion of Ukraine is forcing us to rethink many long-held assumptions, and that, of course, includes assumptions about energy policy and energy security. Just a couple of weeks ago, for example, the President of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, set out plans for the latest round of sanctions against the Kremlin and proposed the phasing out of Russian oil imports into the European Union. Moves to reduce Europe's dependence on Russian gas are also being rapidly accelerated. Energy policy in Germany is shifting dramatically under the new German government, as is shown, of course, by the cancellation of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, while Poland announced in March that it would become independent of Russian gas by the end of this year. Now, there is understandable impatience from Ukraine about the timelines being adopted by many EU states for this transition. The EU depends on Russia for around 25% of its oil supplies, around 40% of its gas. In some countries, the extent of that dependence is even greater. Around 50% of Germany's gas came from Russia at the start of the invasion, and for countries like Estonia, Latvia and Finland, it is over 80%. Now, in Scotland and the UK, by contrast, there is no significant dependence on Russian oil and gas at all, so it's perhaps not for me to lecture others on the pace at which they should turn away from Russian supplies. However, it is clear, I think very clear for all of us, that this transition is increasingly fundamental to national and energy security. It's also clear that to reduce its dependence on Russia, Europe in the short term does need to secure alternative supplies of fossil fuels to keep economies running. So Poland, for example, intends to import liquefied natural gas from the United States. But the debate in Europe, and this is the fundamental point I want to make to you today, the debate in Europe cannot be, and thankfully it is not, just about finding new sources of fossil fuels. It is and must also be about how Europe, including the UK and Scotland, rapidly accelerates its transition to a new lower carbon economy and does so in a way that is just and fair. That task is even more urgent now than ever. Like many in governments across the world, I spent the first half of November last year at the COP26 summit, which was hosted in my home city of Glasgow. As an aside, it is worth, I think, noting the very positive difference made at that summit by the United States once again showing leadership and playing a constructive role in climate negotiations. The personal influence of John Kerry in securing the Glasgow Climate Pact was significant, and I saw that with my own eyes. And partly because of that, the summit in Glasgow achieved some very real progress with, for example, welcome new commitments on financing, reversing forest loss and cutting methane emissions. And the reference in the final agreement to reducing fossil fuel use was important as a first step, although significantly weaker than many had hoped for. But we all knew back in November, even as the gavel dropped on COP26, that the Glasgow Climate Pact did not go far enough. As things stand, the world is on course to exceed not just the threshold of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, but the 2-degree threshold as well. There is an overwhelming scientific consensus that this will be catastrophic. In the words of the UN Secretary General, a 2-degree rise will create a hellscape on Earth. Equally clear is the consensus that to avoid this hellscape and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, global emissions must be halved by the end of this decade. So it's not an exaggeration to say that the 2020s will be the most important decade in human history. Our decisions and our actions over what is now a very, very short period of time will determine how habitable our planet is in decades and for generations to come. The availability of natural resources and the impact of major climate events will also be, as has been the case in the past, a huge factor in global and national security. And so as countries now consider alternative supplies of energy, we must ensure collectively that we do not simply replace one source of oil and gas with another. Countries must prioritise as far as we can an approach to energy security that focuses on sustainability, with measures to promote energy efficiency and to accelerate the development of renewable and low-carbon energy. In many countries,
is there an opportunity for Scotland to ramp up its own oil and gas production to fill some of the gap that Europe has? And is there a way to do that without harming the longer-term climate goal?
So there's sort of two parts of the answer to that. Quickly ramping up oil and gas production is not as easy as some people make it sound. So there's no, in terms of the existing oil fields, not a massive amount of sort of latent unused production that can quickly be ramped up. And in terms of future new oil fields, they take a lot of time, but also I think increasingly we have to ask the questions there, is the short-term imperative really significantly undermining the long-term challenge? Because the route to energy security, what has happened with Russia and Ukraine undoubtedly will mean that fossil fuels have to be replaced, that Russian supplies have to be replaced from elsewhere in the short term. But longer term, if we're going to sustainably achieve energy security and do that in a way that is affordable and cost effective for people, the route to that is renewables and low carbon. So we have to judge, if we're looking at investments for the future, is it better to make that transition to renewable energy? The wind, offshore wind potential we have, the hydrogen that comes from that is vast, and that I think is where we need to put the significant part of our efforts.
Yeah, we have a timing problem either way, both the investments in renewables and the investments in oil and gas takes time to come to fruition. A related question came in from the audience and made it a little self-serving, but I think I might ask it anyway. You recently helped launch the Scottish Council on Global Affairs. Do you see potential linkages with Brookings on energy, trade, and foreign policy?
Absolutely.
I think we have to more.
Well, the Scottish John is indicating a set there, which is good. I mean, just to for a moment, it's an independent or government think tank. It's been founded initially by 3 of our universities, Aberdeen, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and St Andrews. Scotland doesn't have, or didn't have until we launched this Global Council, a foreign affairs think tank, and that's quite incredible. So this is going to be non-partisan, independent, but there is huge potential for it to inform debate Scotland, but contribute to wider debates on foreign affairs. And I know, because I know the people involved in establishing it, there will be a very, very strong appetite to develop links with Brookings. And I will take that message back home with me.
We really appreciate it. Call us maybe. I think I'm going to close the question that moderator's prerogative with one in mind, and that is, as the host of the last conference of the parties, the annual COP meetings of the parties to the Paris Agreement, what do you view as the most important goals for this year's summit in Egypt? And do you have any words of wisdom to share with the Egyptian summit leaders as they plan their own COP coming up?
So my one general comment and then a couple of specifics. Firstly, is we must keep the momentum going. You know, the world's been turned upside down in the last 3 months, but the climate emergency has not gone away, and it hasn't slowed down because of Russia's awful conduct. So we must keep focused. The Glasgow Climate Pact made a lot of progress, but it didn't go far enough to get the world on the track to 1.5 degrees. So, you know, Egypt has a big job to do to corral the world into making the next steps forward. And I think part of the challenge for those in leadership positions is to keep them focused. It's exactly 6 months since COP in Glasgow concluded. Alex Sharma, the UK COP president, is in Glasgow today, making exactly the same point. We come from very different political traditions, but it is welcome that we are making those points. In terms of the specifics, we need to see COP27 make more progress around the transition from fossil fuels. Glasgow had good markers in the final agreement. The second thing, which I tried to champion with the Scottish Government at COP26, that we need to see greater progress on, is what's called loss and damage, recognising that many countries, particularly in the global south, have already suffered the loss and damage of climate change, and we have a moral duty and obligation to help them compensate for that. So these are the things I would like to see. My advice to Egypt, as the leader of the Scottish Government, it was a UK hosted conference obviously, but we tried to play a big part in it. It's massive, it's a massive undertaking, but it's so important that use it to the best and fullest advantage you possibly can.
And this new emphasis on energy security. Energy security never left. We just became suddenly more aware of it on February 24th of this year. How does this renewed emphasis on energy security impact on it? How is this COP going to be different than the one that came before it?
So I think there's a danger, but we need to turn it into an opportunity. So what happened on February 24th, the danger that comes from that is that we think continuing the progress that was made at COP26 is not important. Instead, we have to go back to coal and oil and gas and almost reverse that progress for the short term. The opportunity is to develop an even greater global understanding that the route to energy security lies through renewables and low carbon sources of energy, and actually that's the route to affordable energy as well. So keep our eyes on that prize. Yes, there will be short-term volatilities, but the longer term goal is even more important than it was. So I think the more we can try globally to focus on that, the more hopeful we can be that COP27 builds on the success of COP26, and we don't allow Putin to add to his many war crimes, that of having slowed down the world's progress to net zero and therefore accelerated the inevitability of the climate emergency that we're facing.
Dodge Trident. You have a lot of happy campers in the US for that.
Well, it's a new station. We spoke about it earlier in the Washington Post, so I'm sure
It'll be there, yeah.
First Minister very happy to talk
Because NATO and Trident, aren't they the same thing?
about it. That was great.
Huh?
No, great thing. Yeah,
Huh.
this is yeah, okay.
No, I thought you had to be all together or none.
No.
No?
There's only 3 NATO firms actually host nuclear weapons.
Mm.
Don't.
No.
So it's entirely possible to be a full NATO member.
And we go for Trident, okay. That's Lockheed, right? And what is it?
I'm not sure who the manufacturers are, but I think the First Minister's point when we spoke earlier on at the Washington Post was that in any transition to an independent Scotland, we would be responsible international players. And the United Kingdom may not want to site the weapons in an independent foreign country, but we would just discuss that with them and be straightforward.
Okay,
So,
all right. Okay.